students. Now, you know, now we get, 150 students that get their assignments in. Now we got, 100 students that are late getting their assignments in. So he's kind of set a precedence here. Okay, I gave you a little grace here, I gave this group a little grace here. Now the number's starting to build. And now he's a little frustrated and saying, all right, now if you don't have your work in, in a day, you're going to get an F on it. What? Before you were giving us 2 days to get our assignments in.
Yeah.
Now you only give us a day. This is the 100 students and their frustrated like. And he says, well, he said, according to the syllabus, that, your work is supposed to be due at the end of the semester. And you all agreed to that. You all understood what the syllabus said. And I showed you some grace, I showed you some mercy, and I gave you an extra 2 days to finally get it in, even though you brought it in late. So they got very frustrated with the professor and said, well, that's unjust, that's unfair, and we don't think that's right. So the professor said, well, if that's how you feel, then I'm just going to give you an F. So now they're really frustrated. So what do you mean you're going to give us an F? He said, well, we had an agreement. I showed you some grace and I showed you some mercy, and I gave you 2 extra days to get your assignment in. But you're bucking against the mercy and the grace that I gave you. So since you feel that way about it, I'm just going to give you an F for all 3 assignments, since they all 3 were late. So now the students, of course, they're in a predicament now. The very grace and the mercy that was given to them, they didn't feel that it was enough. So when you look at that little story like that, when we think about our lives, how God's mercy and His grace is with us, and we look at how oftentimes we miss that mercy, we miss that grace, or we just disregard it altogether.
Yeah.
Typically, we start to pull on God's mercy and His grace when we find ourselves in situations that are uncomfortable, situations that we're not used to, which is not a bad thing, because as in our human walk, with God and in life, we're going to run into all kind of different situations. Some are good and some are bad. But in every situation, we need to acknowledge who God really is, and realize that He has our best interest at heart. So even through that kind of, with a tough professor like that, who was really a kind professor, but he allowed His mercy and His grace to go to a point to where people started to take advantage. You ever notice how we, as humans, we're given a little bit of room, but before long, we're all over the place.
Yeah.
Kind of like kids, when they're playing, so we tell them to play in a certain area, and they play in that area, and before long, they're down the street. You're like, wait a minute. I told you to play right here. And before you know it, they're in another neighborhood somewhere, throwing rocks at windows. I know I was notorious for doing that, so I can relate to that. But what is this grace thing? What is grace? We always hear, what is this grace thing? Let's read the book of Psalms, chapter 15. The Bible kind of gives us book of Psalms 15. Psalms 15. God kind of shows us what this grace thing is. Grace is a lot of things. The book of Proverbs talks about grace being the fruit of righteousness. Whoa. A lot of times when you get grace, you're thinking, well, you're thinking it's just God's mercy, His love, His kindness. Grace is all that too. The book of Psalms, and we'll read this. Psalms 15, starting in verse 1. Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? He that walketh uprightly and worketh righteousness, and speaketh the truth in his heart. He that backbiteth not with his tongue, nor doeth evil to his neighbor, nor taketh up a reproach against his neighbor, in whose eyes a vile person is contemned. But he honoreth them that fear the Lord. He that sweareth to his own hurt, and change not. He that putteth not out his money to usury, nor taketh reward against the innocent. He that doeth these things shall never be moved. That's a small picture of what grace is. Grace is, that person who is a just person, who's a holy person, who's a righteous person, who's a person after God's own heart, who knows how to love people, who knows how to treat people with respect, who knows how to come before the throne of God with humility and respect. That's a form of grace. Proverbs chapter 11 tells us in verse 31 that grace is the fruit of righteousness. We say, well, what's the fruit of righteousness? The fruit of righteousness of living out the ordinance of God, walking in love, walking in the Spirit of God, walking in humility, walking in respect, and winning souls for the kingdom of God. Let's look at Matthew chapter 7. Matthew gives us another good illustration. What is this grace thing all about? Matthew chapter 7. A lot of times we hear people say, well, you got grace, man. You got it made. Everybody wants to talk about how great and easy grace is. And grace is easy. Grace is awesome. Grace is the fullness of God. Grace is everything that God has to offer to His children. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 16 through 20, Jesus says this. Matthew 7, 16 through 20. You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorn or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down, is thrown down, is cast in the fire. Wherefore, by